I took a job at the town library because, honestly, it seemed perfect for me. Quiet, easy, and a place where I could indulge my love for books without spending all my money at Barnes& and Noble. It was the main branch in this little Midwestern town. Nothing fancy, just an old brick building tucked between a diner and a thrift store on Jefferson Street. The library closed at 8 p.m. during weekdays, but Friday nights, that was something else. We stayed open until midnight for the study crowd. I always thought that was odd since barely anyone showed up after 9, but it wasn't my place to question the library's traditions. I figured it just gave people a quiet place to read or work, and that sounded nice, until it wasn't. It was a cold Friday in early December, and snowflakes were just starting to stick to the sidewalks. The library's heater wasn't doing much against the chill, so I wore my thickest hoodie while reshelving books. I had the whole place to myself, or so I thought. There was a single person sitting near the back of the library in the small, cozy corner with the old armchairs and reading lamps. It was an older man, probably in his late 60s, wearing a long brown coat. His silver hair gleamed under the reading lamp, and he was flipping through a thick book. The odd thing was, I never saw him come in. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe he'd been here earlier, and I just didn't notice him. The library's policy didn't require me to kick people out unless they were causing trouble, and he seemed harmless. Still, something about him felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but every time I glanced at him, he seemed too still, like unnaturally still. Around 10 p.m., the library fell completely silent. I mean, libraries are always quiet, but this was different. No creaking floors, no distant hum of traffic outside, just this suffocating stillness that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I tried to distract myself by straightening up the magazines near the front desk, but my eyes kept drifting toward the man in the cozy corner. That's when I realized he wasn't reading anymore. His book was closed, and he was staring straight ahead, unblinking. His hands rested on the cover, like he was waiting for something. I told myself to stop being paranoid and went back to work. About 20 minutes later, I was walking past the fiction aisle when I heard it, a soft shuffling sound like someone dragging their feet across the carpet. I froze, my heart pounding. "Hello?" I called out, trying to sound casual, though my voice shook. No response. The shuffling stopped, and I cautiously peeked around the corner. No one was there. I was starting to feel ridiculous. Maybe it was just my sneakers scuffing the floor. I shook my head and turned back toward the front desk. That's when I saw him, the old man, standing at the far end of the aisle, staring at me. I gasped and stumbled back, clutching the bookshelf for support. "Oh, sorry, sir. Can I help you with something?" He didn't answer. He just stood there, his head tilted slightly to the side like he was studying me. His eyes, they were so dark. It was hard to tell where his pupils ended. I tried to brush it off and forced a nervous laugh. "You gave me a little scare there." Still nothing. Just that blank stare. I finally mustered the courage to take a step forward. "Sir, the library's closing soon. Do you need me to help you find anything?" He blinked slowly and then he smiled. But it wasn't a warm smile. It was the kind of grin that makes your stomach twist. "You should leave," he said in a low, raspy voice. "What?" I stammered, taking a step back. "Leave now," he repeated, his smile widening. "Before it gets worse." My chest tightened and my instincts screamed at me to run, but I was frozen, caught in his gaze. Then, as suddenly as he appeared, the old man turned and walked away, his footsteps eerily silent. I stood there for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. Finally, I forced myself to move. I had to find him and make sure he wasn't causing trouble, or worse, hiding somewhere in the library. I checked every aisle, spread out every nook and cranny, but he was gone. Completely gone. It didn't make any sense. The front doors were locked, and the only other exit was the fire door, which would have set off the alarm if he'd opened it. By now, it was close to 11 p.m., and I was seriously questioning my life choices. I wanted to grab my bag, lock up early, and get the hell out of there. But I convinced myself to stick it out for one more hour. I'd tell my boss about the creepy guy tomorrow. I settled behind the front desk and tried to focus on updating the computer system. The sound of typing calmed my nerves, and for a while, I almost forgot about the old man. Almost. The lights flickered. Once, twice, and then dimmed so low that I could barely see across the room. My stomach dropped. Great, I muttered. Of course, the power decides to act up now. I grabbed the flashlight from under the desk and switched it on. The beam cut through the shadows, illuminating the empty library. Empty, except for the cozy corner. The reading lamp was on, and the old man's book was lying open on the armchair. But the man himself was nowhere in sight. I swallowed hard, my fingers tightening around the flashlight. As I approached the chair, I noticed something strange about the book. The pages were covered in symbols, circles, triangles, strange runes that looked like they belonged in a horror movie. They were drawn in thick, dark ink that almost looked wet. "What the hell is this?" I whispered. That's when I felt it, the unmistakable sensation of someone breathing down my neck. I spun around, the flashlight trembling in my hand. Nothing. But then, from somewhere deeper in the library, I heard it. A low, guttural growl. It echoed off the shelves, growing louder and closer. My pulse skyrocketed, and I stumbled backward, nearly dropping the flashlight. I ran back toward the front desk, my mind racing. I didn't care about the books or my shift anymore. I needed to get out. As I reached for my bag, the growling stopped. The silence was worse. It was like the air had been sucked out of the room. I clutched the flashlight and slowly turned around, scanning the dark aisles. And then I saw them. Dozens of shadowy figures stood between the bookshelves, their forms barely visible in the dim light. They didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, watching me. My breath came in short gasps as I backed toward the front door. "Please," I whispered, though I didn't know who I was talking to. "Let me go." The figures didn't react, but then one of them stepped forward. It wasn't the old man. This figure was taller, with impossibly long limbs and a face that seemed to shift in the darkness, its mouth stretched into a grotesque grin, revealing rows of jagged teeth. I screamed and bolted for the door, fumbling with the keys. My hands were shaking so badly that I kept dropping them. Behind me, the growling returned, louder and more menacing. Finally, the lock clicked, and I yanked the door open. Cold air hit my face as I stumbled onto the sidewalk, tears streaming down my cheeks. I turned back, expecting to see the figures chasing me, but the library was empty. The lights were back on, and everything looked normal. I didn't wait to find out what was going on. I ran to my car, a beat-up Toyota Corolla, and drove straight home, ignoring every red light. The next morning, I called my boss and quit. I didn't care about the paycheck. Nothing was worth going back to that place. But the thing is, I can't stop thinking about the old man's warning. Leave before it gets worse. What did he mean? What could be worse than what I saw? Sometimes, late at night, I dream about those shadows, and when I wake up, I swear I can still hear them growling. When I started working at the town library, it seemed like the perfect gig. Quiet, low stress, and just a few blocks from my tiny apartment. It was one of those older buildings that still had creaky wooden floors, tall windows with frosted glass, and shelves that smelled of dust and aging paper. The kind of place that always felt a little too still, even when it was full of people. From day one, I was told the same thing. The basement archives were strictly off limits. "Renovations," my boss said dismissively when I asked why. He didn't elaborate, and I didn't push it. I had no reason to care about what was or wasn't happening down there. Not at first, anyway. One evening, a few months into the job, I was working the late shift. Most nights were quiet after 8 p.m., and this was no exception. I was shelving books near the stairwell when I heard it. A faint sound, like someone whispering. I paused, the spine of a book still in my hand, and tilted my head to listen. The sound was soft, muffled, and seemed to be coming from the direction of the basement door. My first thought was that it was one of my coworkers, maybe chatting on the phone or talking to someone out of sight. But when I peeked around the corner, there was no one there. I told myself it was nothing, probably the pipes or the old ventilation system acting up. Still, the sound lingered in my mind for the rest of the night, even as I locked up and headed home. The whispers didn't stop after that. Every time I worked late, I'd hear them, faint but unmistakable, coming from behind the heavy basement door. It got to the point where I started avoiding that part of the library altogether. But it didn't matter. The whispers seemed to follow me. I'd hear them while I was shelving books, while I was sitting at the front desk, even when I was alone in the break room. I tried to ignore it, to brush it off as my imagination, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. One night, I finally decided to bring it up with my boss. "Hey," I said casually, "what's the deal with the basement? I keep hearing these weird noises coming from down there." He stiffened immediately. "The basement is off limits," he said sharply. "You're not to go down there. Is that clear?" His reaction startled me. He wasn't just annoyed, he looked scared. "Yeah, of course," I stammered. "I was just curious." "Don't be," he snapped and walked away. That should have been the end of it. I should have taken the hint and left well enough alone. But his reaction only made me more curious, and the whispers, they were getting louder, more insistent. It was like they were calling me, pulling me toward the basement, no matter how hard I tried to resist. One Friday night, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. The library was empty except for me, and I was closing up for the night. As I walked past the basement door, the whispers started again, louder than ever. My chest tightened and my hands started to shake, but instead of walking away, I found myself reaching for the handle. The door was locked, of course. But as I stood there staring at it, I noticed something strange. The lock, it looked old, almost rusted, like it hadn't been touched in years. And yet, when I tried the handle again, it turned easily, the door creaking open with a low groan. The stairwell beyond was dark, the air damp and heavy. I hesitated at the top step, my flashlight trembling in my hand. Every instinct screamed at me to close the door and walk away. But I couldn't. Something compelled me to go down. The stairs creaked under my weight as I descended, the light from my flashlight cutting through the darkness. At the bottom, I found myself in a large, low-ceilinged room filled with dusty shelves and filing cabinets. The air smelled of mildew and rust, and the faint sound of dripping water echoed somewhere in the distance. At first, it seemed like a normal storage area, old books, faded documents, and stacks of newspapers. But as I moved deeper into the room, I started to notice odd things. A stack of photos scattered across a table, their edges curled with age. The faces in the photos stared back at me, their eyes empty, their expressions unnervingly blank. Then I saw it, a door at the far end of the room. Unlike the rest of the basement, this door was wooden, its surface scratched and weathered. It looked out of place, like it didn't belong there. The whispers were louder now, coming from behind the door. I didn't want to open it. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to turn around and leave, but my hand was already on the handle, twisting it slowly. The room beyond was smaller, lit by a single flickering bulb. My heart dropped as the light revealed what was inside. The walls were covered in posters, hundreds of them, maybe more. Each one was a missing person notice. Some were old, their edges yellowed and torn, while others looked recent, their ink still vibrant. My stomach churned as I read the names and dates. They were all from this town, spanning decades. And at the bottom of each poster was the same line, "Last seen at the library." I stumbled back, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. In the center of the room was a small table, and on it sat a single book. Its leather cover was cracked and faded, and it was coated in a thick layer of dust. I didn't want to go near it, but something drew me closer. The whispers were deafening now, almost like they were inside my head. My hands trembled as I opened the book. The pages were blank at first, but as I flipped through, words began to appear, scrawled in dark, jagged ink. And then I saw it, my name. My name and today's date. I dropped the book and staggered back, my head spinning. The whispers had stopped, replaced by a suffocating silence. I turned to leave, but the door was gone. The walls were solid, the exit completely sealed. The light bulb flickered once, twice, and then went out, plunging the room into darkness. I screamed, fumbling for my flashlight, but it wouldn't turn on. The air grew colder, and I felt it. Something brushing against my shoulder, something icy and sharp. And then the whispers returned. I don't know how I got out. The next thing I remember, I was standing outside the library, the cold night air stinging my face. My hands were empty, but I could still feel the weight of the book. My chest ached and my head pounded as I stumbled away. I never went back to that library. I couldn't. But the whispers, they haven't left me. They're faint now, almost like they're waiting. And every time I close my eyes, I see that book and my name and the date. Working at the library, you get used to strange encounters, patrons with odd habits, misplaced books turning up in the weirdest places, or requests for titles you'd swear couldn't exist. But nothing could have prepared me for the night of the borrowed book. It was a rainy Tuesday evening, the kind of night where the sound of water against the tall windows made the library feel even quieter than usual. There were only a few patrons left, a college student buried in their laptop at the far corner table, and an older man dozing in one of the oversized armchairs near the mystery section. I was at the circulation desk, scanning through the returns cart, when a woman walked up. She was in her mid-30s, dressed in a raincoat with her hood down, her damp hair clinging to her cheeks. Her eyes darted nervously around, like she didn't want to be here any longer than she had to. "Hi," she said, her voice shaky. "I need to return this." She placed a book on the counter. It wasn't unusual. Returns are what I handle all, but something about her tone made me look up. Her hands were trembling, and she wouldn't make eye contact. "No problem," I said, scanning the barcode on the book's spine. "What was wrong with it? Water damage, pages missing?" "I didn't check it out," she interrupted. Her words caught me off guard. "You didn't check it out?" "No, it was on my account, but I've never seen it before. It was in my mailbox this morning. I figured maybe someone made a mistake, but..." Her voice trailed off and her expression darkened. "I don't know who would have sent it to me, or why." Curious, I glanced at the screen. Sure enough, the book was listed under her name. It had been checked out 2 days ago, late at night. My stomach churned. The library closed at 8 p.m., and I was certain no one had borrowed anything after hours. Did someone else in your household check it out for you?" I asked, though the unease in my chest told me the answer. She shook her head. "I live alone." I picked up the book. The cover was plain, black with no title, just the library's sticker near the bottom. It didn't feel like any of the usual books we circulated. The leather binding was old, and the corners were worn, as if it had passed through too many hands over too many years. I opened it. The first page was blank, save for a faint watermark of an eye at the center. I flipped to the next page and froze. The drawing stopped me cold. It was a pencil sketch, simple but disturbingly detailed. It was her. The woman standing in front of me, drawn in stunning accuracy, right down to the shape of her raincoat and the damp strands of hair framing her face. She was sitting at what looked like her dining table, a cup of coffee in front of her. But there was something wrong. Her eyes were wide with fear, staring at a dark figure looming behind her, its hands reaching for her shoulders. "What the hell?" I whispered. The woman leaned forward, catching a glimpse of the page. Her hand shot to her mouth as she gasped. That's me," she stammered. "That's my kitchen." My fingers shook as I flipped to the next page. Another sketch, just as vivid. This time she was outside, standing on her front porch. Her hands were pressed against her face, and a shadowy figure was in the doorway, its distorted form half hidden behind her. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice rising. "Is this some kind of sick joke?" I I don't know," I stuttered. "We don't even have books like this in our system." I turned another page. The sketches grew worse. Each one depicted her in a more horrifying situation than the last. In one, she was in her car, looking into the rearview mirror, where two glowing eyes stared back at her. In another, she was running through what looked like a forest, her face streaked with tears, while a monstrous figure trailed behind her, its claws stretched forward. "I need to go," she said abruptly, backing away from the counter. This is insane." I wanted to agree, to tell her to leave and forget any of this ever happened. But I couldn't stop flipping through the book. The images felt alive, as though they were changing every time I looked at them. And then I reached the final page. My blood turned to ice. The drawing showed her lying on the library floor, her lifeless eyes staring up at the ceiling. Her raincoat was torn, and her hand reached toward something just out of the frame, a long, dark figure with claws dripping black ink. I slammed the book shut and stepped back. My chest felt tight, and my breathing grew shallow. I couldn't look at her. I don't know what this is," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "What's on the last page?" she asked, her voice trembling. I shook my head. "You don't want to know." She grabbed the book from the counter before I could stop her and flipped to the end. Her scream echoed through the library, raw and piercing. She dropped the book as if it had burned her, backing away until she hit the shelf behind her. "That's me!" she cried. "That's me! Dead! What the hell is this? Who would do this?" Before I could respond, the lights flickered. The rain outside had picked up, the sound of it pounding against the windows. I stepped around the counter, trying to calm her, but she wouldn't stop backing away, her eyes darting around the room. "It's here," she whispered. "Oh my God, it's here." "What's here?" I asked, my voice trembling. She didn't answer. Her gaze locked onto something behind me, and her face went pale. I turned slowly, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. There was nothing there, just rows of shelves stretching into the shadows. "Please," she whispered, grabbing my arm. "You have to get rid of it. Burn it. Tear it apart. Whatever it is, it's following me. I can feel it." I nodded, picking up the book with trembling hands. I'll take care of it," I said, though I had no idea what that meant. She didn't wait for an explanation. She bolted out of the library, the door slamming shut behind her, leaving me alone with the cursed thing. The moment she left, the whispers started. Soft at first, barely audible over the rain. Then louder, echoing off the shelves, circling me. The book felt heavy in my hands, as if it were alive, pulsing with some dark energy. I wanted to throw it, to run and never look back. But I couldn't move. My legs were rooted to the spot. Finally, I forced myself to open it one last time. The page with her final sketch was gone. In its place was a new drawing. Me. I was at the circulation desk, hunched over the book. My face was twisted in terror, and behind me loomed the same dark figure, its claws reaching for my throat. The flashlight on the counter flickered, casting long, jagged shadows on the walls. The whispers grew louder, closer, until they weren't whispers anymore. They were breathing. Heavy, guttural breathing, right behind me. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The next morning, when the other librarians arrived, they found the book on the floor behind the desk. I was gone. They say the library's security cameras didn't catch anything unusual that night, but the book? It's still there, locked away in the archives where no one dares to touch it. The last page is still blank. For now. It was the fall of 1973, and I had just started my first semester at a small community college nestled in the rolling hills of Pennsylvania. The campus library was the oldest building in town, with its heavy oak doors and stone facade weathered by decades of storms. Inside, it smelled of old paper, varnished wood, and faint mildew, the kind of smell that clung to your clothes long after you left. One afternoon, after a particularly dull lecture, I decided to spend some time studying in the library. I'd heard from classmates about the silent reading room, a space on the top floor where you could hear a pin drop. It sounded perfect for someone like me who needed absolute quiet to focus. The room itself was tucked away at the end of a long, narrow hallway lined with faded portraits of old professors and benefactors. A brass plaque on the door read, "Silent Reading Room, no talking allowed." The door creaked as I pushed it open, and I was immediately greeted by a profound stillness, like stepping into a vacuum. The room was long and rectangular, with high arched windows that let in slivers of pale afternoon light. Heavy wooden tables were arranged in neat rows, each one paired with a stiff-backed chair. A scattering of people sat hunched over their books, their faces downcast, their movements precise and muted. No one so much as glanced at me as I entered. I chose a seat near the back, far from the others, and pulled out my notebook. As I settled in, I noticed a small sign on the table. Strictly enforced. No talking, no whispering, no disturbances. For the first hour, everything was normal. The only sounds were the faint scratch of pens on paper and the occasional rustle of a page being turned. But as I flipped through my notes, I began to hear something faint, just on the edge of my awareness. It sounded like whispering. I glanced up, scanning the room. Everyone was exactly as they'd been before, heads down, absorbed in their work. No one was speaking, not even moving enough to suggest a conversation. I shook it off, figuring it was my mind playing tricks on me, but the sound didn't go away. If anything, it grew louder. It was a strange kind of whispering, almost rhythmic, like a chant spoken in hushed tones. I couldn't make out any words, but it filled the room, pressing against my ears in a way that made my skin crawl. I tried to focus on my notes, but the whispers grew more insistent, like they were coming from just behind me. My stomach tightened, and I couldn't resist turning around. There was no one there. I glanced at the others in the room, hoping to catch someone smirking or glancing my way, but they were all frozen in their tasks. It was as though I were invisible to them. That's when I noticed something that made my pulse quicken. No one was turning pages anymore. They were sitting perfectly still, their heads bent low, their hands resting motionless on the tables. It was like they were listening. The whispers grew louder, overlapping now, as though multiple voices were speaking at once. I tried to catch a word, a phrase, anything to make sense of it, but the voices were too garbled, too strange. My heart raced as I stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. For a moment, all the whispers stopped. Every head in the room turned to look at me. Their movements were eerily synchronized, slow and deliberate. Their faces were blank, their eyes glassy, like they weren't really seeing me. My throat tightened as I took a step back, bumping into the table behind me. "I'm sorry," I stammered, even though I knew they wouldn't or couldn't respond. My voice sounded out of place in the oppressive silence, echoing against the high ceilings. Grabbing my notebook, I bolted for the door. As soon as I stepped into the hallway, the whispers returned, louder than ever. This time, they were inside my head. "Don't leave," the voices murmured, the words overlapping and twisting. "You're not finished." I ran down the stairs, nearly tripping in my rush to get out of the building. The librarian at the front desk gave me a strange look as I passed, but I didn't stop to explain. The whispers followed me all the way to my car, swirling in my ears like a storm. I didn't go back to the library after that, but the voices, they didn't stay behind. That night, as I sat in my tiny apartment, the whispers returned. They started softly, like a breeze rustling through the leaves outside my window. But soon they grew louder, filling the room with that same rhythmic chant I'd heard in the reading room. I tried to drown them out with music, with the TV, but nothing worked. The voices were everywhere, in the hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the floorboards, even in the static between radio stations. By the third night, I hadn't slept at all. The whispers were relentless, growing more insistent with every passing hour. My apartment felt smaller, darker, as though the walls were closing in around me. Desperate, I grabbed my notebook and flipped through the pages, hoping for some kind of distraction. That's when I saw it. Words scrawled across the margins of my notes in a handwriting that wasn't mine. "We told you not to leave." I slammed the notebook shut and threw it across the room, my chest heaving. The whispers swelled, a cacophony of voices screaming over each other until I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my keys and ran out the door, determined to get as far away as possible. But as I drove through the dark, empty streets, the voices followed me. They filled the car, rising above the hum of the engine, and I realized with growing horror that they weren't just whispers anymore. They were laughing. I don't remember much after that. The next thing I knew, I was parked outside the library, the building looming in the darkness. I don't know why I went back, but it was like something had taken over, pulling me toward the place I'd sworn to avoid. The front doors were unlocked, and the library was dark and silent as I stepped inside. The whispers guided me, pulling me toward the staircase and up to the silent reading room. My hands shook as I pushed open the door. The room was empty, the air heavy and still. On the table where I'd sat days earlier, my notebook lay open. The pages were blank, except for a single line scrawled across the center. "Sure, you belong to us now." The lights flickered, and the door slammed shut behind me. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the whispers, now louder than ever. They filled the room, the air, my head, until there was nothing left but their laughter. I never left that room, at least not in the way I'd hoped. Some nights, if you sit there long enough, you might hear me whispering too.